Xin chào các bạn, chào mừng tất cả các bạn đã đến với chương trình Lịch sử hào hùng, một chương trình được đặc biệt tạo ra bởi iKSIELTS giúp cho việc luyện tập nghe tiếng Anh trở nên thú vị hơn qua những chủ đề lịch sử. Để luyện tập tốt hơn, hãy cùng quét mã bài tập ở góc phải màn hình hoặc click vào phần mô tả để luyện tập tốt nhất nhé. Ok, bắt đầu thôi!
There is a road considered legendary in Vietnam, and perhaps everyone knows it as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. However, not everyone knows that there is a legendary road within this legend. What is it? It's the road that later made engineers from China, Russia, and the US marvel in admiration. The fuel pipeline running along Ho Chi Minh Trail. This is the road that American generals never anticipated, which made them exclaim that Vietnam fuel pipeline was a true legend. From 1968 to 1974, the Vietnamese military constructed a fuel pipeline that spanned a total of 500 kilometers, the longest in the world at that time. It wasn't until 10 years later that China managed to build a longer pipeline. Thanks to this pipeline, new trucks had fuel to transport goods into the battlefields, and tanks and aircraft could fight to liberate the South and reunite the country. It was so crucial that the leadership of the General Department of Logistics once said that if necessary, they would cover the pipeline with gold to ensure its construction. So, why is this road called legendary? It's because we had to build it under extremely challenging conditions. Everyone knows that the US is the pioneer in the oil industry, and they are the ones who abolished the gold standard and established the oil standard. So more than anyone, they understood how crucial fuels is to every nation. The question they posed was how our trucks had fuel to run and supply goods, how our planes had fuel to fly, and where our tanks got fuel to fight. Because of these questions, in 1968, all fuels trucks supplying the southern battlefields were heavily attacked. The military had to come up with various methods to transport fuel to the southern battlefields. Initially, the idea was to put fuel into plastic bags and carry them in backpacks to supply the battlefields. However, this method was ineffective and couldn't be implemented long-term. 200 people could only carry less than 2 barrels of fuels, and many soldiers suffered from fuel poisoning and lead exposure, some even dying on the transport route. This method was not sustainable, so we switched to using 20-liter cans or transporting barrels of fuels across streams. This method was also short-lived because it took 2 weeks to transport fuel that would only last for 2 days for trucks operations. Finally, we came up with the idea of gathering anything that could be considered a pipe to connect into a fuel pipeline. This included water pipes, bamboo pipes, and even wooden pipes. This method proved somewhat effective as we no longer had to exert much effort, but after a short time, it was unsustainable due to the bamboo pipe not withstanding the pressure, leading to the fuel leakage. Using 100 meters was feasible, but extending it to thousands of kilometers was impossible. Fortunately, during a business trip to the Soviet Union, General Võ Nguyên Giáp observed their methods of transporting fuels and brought it back to Vietnam for implementation. The problem seems to be solved, but the circumstances of the Soviet Union and Vietnam were entirely different. First, the Soviet Union has an excellent air and defense system, while we did not. If the US bombed us, what would we do? Second, their pipelines were for short-term campaigns, while ours was for a long-term strategy to liberate the South. Would it last long enough? And how would we repair it if it broke? Third, our mountainous terrain was extremely complex. During a meeting, all the generals were silent, searching for a solution. But immediately, Lieutenant General Dinh Đức Thiện accepted the challenge and promised General Giáp to study and quickly implement it. The implementation was even more challenging, as it had to ensure secrecy. It had to be secret to proceed, and without secrecy, it couldn't be done. This required us to conduct extreme measures to prevent the enemy from discovering the pipeline's location. This was relatively simple, but somehow the enemy still managed to bomb the place, we were installing the pipeline. Sometimes they even bombed location before we installed the pipeline. At this point, our military has to solve a much tougher problem: how to install the pipeline to bypass the enemy's meticulous and scientific calculations. If the pipeline crossed rivers, it had to be submerged to avoid being swept away by floods, damaged by bombs, and undetectable by the enemy. On land, the pipeline has to be buried deeply, which fills above where people continue to farm normally. In flat areas, our problem was solved. But what about in hilly, steep terrains? Installing it traditionally would definitely lead to it being bombed and destroyed. However, if not installed traditionally, we would have to elevate it to mountain peaks up to 1,000 meter height. How would pumps push fuel through such height? The pressure on the pipe would reach 400 atmospheres, risking ruptures. Eventually, our military found a solution, using pumps to gradually push the fuel up in stages, bit by bit, until it finally crossed the mountains without damaging the pipe. This was considered a Guinness World Record at that time, as no other country dared to think of such method, let alone implement it. Fortunately, there was no Guinness World Record recognition then, or we would have been exposed. It seemed that the toughest problem was solved, and the fuel flowed steadily into the battlefields, allowing our troops to fight with peace of mind. However, in 1972, when the US resumed bombing Hanoi and Haiphong, our fuel supply from Russia couldn't enter Haiphong port. This forced us to extend the pipeline to Lacson to receive fuels from Russia via China's Fangshe port. This also explains why the total length of Vietnam's fuel pipeline reached 5,000 kilometers, the longest in the world at that time. And it made the Americans exclaim that Vietnam's fuel pipeline was a true legend.
Các bạn thấy thế nào về chủ đề vừa rồi? Và bạn muốn biết thêm gì nữa? Hãy cùng comment cho mình biết nhé. Chương trình hôm nay đã kết thúc tại đây. Hẹn gặp các bạn vào số sau nhé. Đừng quên ấn like và subscribe cho IKSIELTS nhé.